Lyndon Baines Johnson was born in Stonewall, Texas on 27th August 1908. He grew up in Johnson City, Texas. Hated to lose, especially an argument. Johnson's father and grandfather were politicians in Texas. Johnson grew up listening behind the scenes deal making and collect political gossip. Lyndon's mother had dreams for Lyndon. Her adored firstborn were especially grand, and she never let him forget that she expected great things from him. In 1924, Johnson graduated from Johnson City High School as president of his six-member senior class. Despite his parents' wishes, he did not want to go to college. Restless, he drove with friends to California, where he took odd jobs. About a year later, he became back at home on the road construction game. Finally, relenting to family pressure, Johnson borrowed $75 in 1927 and enrolled in Southwest Texas State Teachers College, now Texas State University, in San Marcos. To help cover costs, he worked as a janitor and an office helper for the college president. He left for 1 year to teach 5th, 6th, and 7th grades at an impoverished, segregated Mexican-American school in South Texas town of Cotulla. When Johnson returned to college, he starred on a debate team, edited the new school newspaper, and threw himself into the wheeling and dealing of student politics. By 1930, as the Great Depression took hold and teaching jobs paid little, he began teaching at Sam Houston High School and becoming a member of the Democratic Party. Johnson also graduated with a bachelor's degree in education. Around 1932, newly elected U.S. Congressman Richard Kleberg D. Corpus Christi asked him to come to Washington to work as an assistant. Kleberg, who was born into the wealthy King Ranch family in South Texas, allowed LBJ to run the office and do much of the political work. Richard Kleberg mentored Lyndon on establishing political favoritism, quid pro quo arrangements, where government resources or influence might be used to benefit personal business interests. This was very common in Texas and in politics around this era. Over the years, Johnson established his reputation, political connections, and studied law from Georgetown University Law School. In September 1934, Lyndon heard about a woman named Claudia Taylor, nicknamed Lady Bird, through a mutual friend. He was told she came from a wealthy family and one that had deep roots and high standing in Texas society. Johnson agreed to meet her. On his first date with her, he asked her to marry him. While Johnson was in Washington, he asked Lady Bird to write him a letter every day while 1,200 miles separated them. Throughout their short courtship, the young couple exchanged nearly 90 letters filled with candor and expression of love. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal relief program during the Great Depression included the National Youth Administration, which provided education and jobs for teens and young adults. In 1935, Johnson was hired as a NYA's Texas director. The job allowed him to travel around Texas seeking financial sponsors for NYA construction projects. Within 6 months, 18,000 young Texans were working on the roads, parks, schools, and other public buildings, and Johnson had a network of supporters in every corner of Texas. In 1937, the 10th Congressional District of U.S. House of Representatives Democratic Party member James P. Buchanan mysteriously passed away from a heart attack. Johnson resigned in 1937 to run against 9 opponents for the U.S. House of Representatives for the 10th District in Texas. Wellie Kennan Hopkins met Johnson and told his friend Charles Edward Marsh about his passionate New Dealer. Marsh was also a supporter of the New Deal and ordered the editors of his 2 newspapers in Austin to back him. Lady Bird called her father and borrowed $10,000 of her inheritance for the campaign. Johnson won the seat but celebrated from a hospital bed while recovering from emergency appendectomy. He was 29, and his 10th congressional district included the impoverished hill country he knew so well. Hopkins claimed that Johnson's victory was in no small part thanks to Marsh's editorial support, and suspected that he helped the young politician as a way of extending his own influence. During this period, Johnson met Edward Clark, who worked for the governor of Texas. The two men became close friends. Later, Clark became a lawyer in Austin and helped to guide Johnson's political career. Clark also introduced Johnson to important figures in the oil industry such as Clint Murchison and Harrison L. Hunt. These men also helped to finance Johnson's political campaigns. In this period of time, Nazi influence was spreading and was in power. Erich Leidsdorf escaped Nazi Austria and, with the help of Charles Edward Marsh and Edward's wife Alice, and was facing challenges to immigration status in the United States. Johnson was still part of the New Deal program and used his political influence to help Leidsdorf navigate the bureaucracy. Johnson, Charles Edward Marsh, and Edward's wife Alice began doing more on their behalf, eventually helping hundreds of Jewish refugees to reach safety in Texas through Cuba, Mexico, and South America countries. Lady Bird Johnson acknowledged the help that Charles Edward Marsh provided to her husband. Marsh rewarded Johnson by helping him in his campaign to return to Congress. He gave instructions to Charles E. Green, editor of the Austin American Statesman, to give Johnson help to be reelected. On 30th January 1938, Charles E. Green thought he did a great job and knew that he was going to be unopposed and leave burden to LBJ. So that way it could give him his undivided time to his service in the session that will run almost until primary election day. During his campaign, Johnson had promised that if the day ever comes when my vote was cast to send your boy to the trenches, that day Lyndon Johnson will leave his Senate seat and go with them. Johnson complained that he found it difficult managing on his Congress salary. Marsh arranged for Johnson's wife to buy 19 acres of Lake Austin for $8,000, which he knew was an area that was likely to be developed and would increase dramatically in value. Lady Bird Johnson later sold the land for $330,000. He also provided the money for Johnson to buy Fort Worth radio station that he said would be someday worth $3 million. Marsh also offered Johnson the opportunity to buy some of the oil wells cheaply. Johnson declined the offer, and as he feared that this could kill him politically, during the 1938 campaign, Marsh agreed to ask his business friends to contribute to the campaign. He eventually paid Johnson $5,000 a week. Mary Louise Glass, Marsh's private secretary, said it was her job to keep track of who paid. Johnson became a regular visitor to Marsh's home at Longlia. Marsh was often on business trips, and Johnson developed a close relationship with Alice Glass. She told her sister, Mary Louise, that Johnson had limitless potential. She thought he was a young man who was going to save the world. She decided to help him become a successful politician. According to her sister, Alice taught him how to dress and how to eat food. She recommended the reading of books including the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Alice also advised him on how to be photographed. She told him that his left side was much better than his right. For the rest of his life, he would try to allow only the left side to be seen in photographs. Frank C. Ultroff was a regular visitor to Longlia. He later recalled, Alice Glass was the most elegant woman I ever met, and Longlia was the most elegant home I ever stayed in. Arnold Gint, who photographed the world's most attractive woman for Vanity Fair, described Alice as the most beautiful woman he had ever met. He also considered Longlia as the most beautiful place he had ever seen, and asked for his ashes to be scattered on the estate. Marsh's eldest daughter by his first marriage, Antoinette Marsh Haskell, did not like Alice. She, Alice, took on the privileges of a great beauty and was very self-serving and demanding. She was a real courtesan. She knew what she was doing. Alice told her cousin, Alice Hopkins, the wife of the politician of Welly Kennan Hopkins, that by the end of 1938, that she and Johnson were lovers. Miss Hopkins later recalled they were unbelievably discreet and no one could have guessed that they were lovers. Nothing showed, nothing at all. Alice told her sister Mary Lewis, who had become one of Marsh's secretaries. Mary Lewis claims that Lyndon was the love of Alice's life. My sister was mad for Lyndon, absolutely mad for him. She later recalled that Marsh spent a lot of time away on businesses. It was during that time that Alice and Johnson were together at Longlia. When Marsh was at the home of Johnson, often brought his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. She later told Philip Copper, the author of An Anonymous Giver, A Life of Charles E. Marsh, that Alice was so tall and blonde that she looked like a Valkyrie. Later that evening, Lady Bird also admitted that she helped educate Lyndon and me, particularly about music and more elegant lifestyle than he and I spent our early days enjoying. Alice Glass gave birth to 2 children while she was with Charles Edward Marsh, but refused to marry him. Alice's sister, Mary Louise Glass, explained her unusual character. She, Alice, was a free spirit, very independent, in an era when women weren't that way. Above everything else, Alice was an idealist. She had a very particular view of the kind of place, and she was willing to do anything she had to do to make things come out right for people who were in trouble. According to Mary Lewis, Alice wanted to marry Johnson. He was in a difficult position as in the 1930s a divorced man would be effectively barred from political career. Johnson considered taking a job as a corporate lobbyist in Washington. Alice rejected this idea as she considered he had the potential to become the President of the United States. Texas newspapers were overwhelmingly against President Franklin D. Roosevelt, but Marsh's 6 Texas newspapers, including the influential Austin American Statesman and the state capitol, supported the New Deal. As a result, Roosevelt agreed to Marsh's request to see him. Edwin M. Watson, his appointment secretary, wrote on 14th July 1939, "Put Mr. Charles Marsh down for an appointment with the President on Wednesday. Mr. Marsh is the owner of a large string of papers supporting the President in Texas." Marsh decided to take this opportunity to introduce Roosevelt to his new protege, Johnson. In late 1939, Charles Edward Marsh discovered that Alice Glass was having an affair with Johnson. Marsh's daughter, Antoinette Marsh Haskell, said he knew that she had been unfaithful in the past, but her relationship with Johnson infuriated him. After loudly berating Johnson, Marsh threw him out. The next morning, Johnson returned and apologized. He also promised to end the relationship with Alice, and Marsh forgave him. Antoinette commented, "They didn't let her come between them. Men in power like that don't give a damn about your women. They were not that important in the end. They treated women like toys. That's just the way it was. Soon afterwards, Alice agreed to marry Marsh. The marriage did not last long, and Johnson then resumed his affair with Alice. At the request of President Roosevelt, Johnson was appointed to the House Committee on Naval Affairs on June 21, 1940. He was commissioned lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve. In 1941, John Morris Shepherd, United States Democratic senator, mysteriously died in the office of a fatal brain hemorrhage. General Douglas MacArthur told Miss Shepherd that her husband had been the first casualty of World War II in 1941. Lyndon ran for the remaining term of U.S. Senator Morris Shepherd of Texas. Tommy Corcoran agreed to help Johnson in his campaign to replace Shepherd. This included helping Johnson obtain approval of rural electrification project from the Rural Electrification Administration. Corcoran also arranged to Franklin D. Roosevelt to make a speech on the eve of the polls criticizing Johnson's opponent, Wilbur Lee O'Daniel. In the only race he ever lost, he was defeated by Democratic Texas Governor W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel by 1,311 votes, but kept his congressional seat. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Johnson became the first member of Congress to volunteer for active military duty. Lyndon persuaded FDR to send him on an inspection tour of U.S. military forces in the Pacific. It was a political stunt to get recognition for a Silver Star, one of the first recipient case of stolen valor. Lyndon lied about his plane came under enemy fire against the Japanese Zero War plane. Bob Marshall, the gunner of the plane, never came under fire that day, never received a Silver Star for that moment. On June 9, 1942, Johnson received the Silver Star from General Douglas MacArthur. He returned to Washington in 1942 and wore the Silver Star service ribbon on his jacket lapel for the rest of his life. In 1943, the Lady Bird Johnson purchased KTBC, the Federal Communication Commission, which reviewed all broadcast license transfers, was close to being abolished. Lyndon Johnson used his political influence in both Congress and the White House to prevent that from happening. The FCC was among the most politicized agencies in the government. Johnson socialized with FCC Commissioner Clifford Durr at that time. Durr says Johnson never mentioned Lady Bird's application for KTBC's license. Lady Bird, however, directly approached Durr about the station, and Lyndon phoned James Barr of the FCC Standard Broadcast Division. He wanted to get a radio station, and what I remember is he wouldn't take a no for an answer. Carroll quotes Barr. Legendary Democratic fixer Tommy the Corcoran also helped with the KTBC application all up and down the line, is how Corcoran put it. Asked in an interview whether Johnson's status as a member of the Congress helped his wife application, Corcoran said, "How do you think these guys work? These guys, FCC staffers, have been around. You don't have to spell things out for them." The Los Angeles Times and USA Today obituaries make it sound as if KTBC were cogently unprofitable station at the time of Lady Bird's bid and gave the impression that she was the lone suitor for that property. That was not the case, as Carroll documents the identities of the other interested bidders. Once Lady Bird completed her purchase of KTBC, the 5 years of delay and red tape or delays and unfavorable rules from the FCC that had stymied the previous owners vanished. The slowness was replaced by speed, according to Carroll. In short order, she got permission to broadcast 24 hours a day. KTBC had been sunrise to sunset station, and move it to 590 on the dial, an uncluttered end of the dial where it could be heard in 38 surrounding Texas counties. It was no coincidence. Lyndon and Lady Bird recruited a new station manager promising 10% of profits, and Lyndon told him that the changes in the license restriction that would make KTBC a moneymaker were all set. In 1945, the FCC okayed KTBC's request to quintuple its power, which cast its signal over 63 counties compared to 38. When Lyndon visited William S. Paley, president of CBS Radio, and asked if KTBC could become a CBS affiliate and carry its lucrative programming, he didn't have to spell out why the request should be granted. The radio networks feared the regulators in Washington as well as the members of Congress who regulated the regulators. K-Now and Austin had been repeatedly denied the affiliation because of San Antonio affiliate could be heard in Austin. CBS Director of Research Frank Stanton approved Johnson's request. Johnson shook down powerful companies to advertise on the station. Local businesses that wanted army camps to remain located in Austin knew one way to secure Lyndon's help was to advertise on KTBC. Miss Johnson's ability as a businesswoman was not the crucial factor in the acquisition of the station, or once it was acquired in its early growth. Lyndon Johnson had worked at politics for years to achieve power. Now he was working at politics to make money. Under Texas law, the station belonged solely to Lady Bird because she purchased it with her inheritance. But as her spouse, Lyndon owned half of all profits. He was ultra active in recruiting staff and running the operation by 1948. Carol writes, he was telling his friends that he was a millionaire. The Johnsons earned thousands from their radio station, but millions from their TV stations, writes former FCC official William B. Ray in his book, FCC, The Ups and Downs of Radio Regulation. The commission allocated one commercial station to Austin in early 1950s, and the Johnsons were its sole applicant. Filing a competing application would have been a waste of money. Ray writes, because the Johnsons' political clout, whenever there was business matter to be discussed between CBS and LBJ stations, Johnson would summon the appropriate CBS personnel to the White House to discuss it. He continues, in 1948, Johnson decided to make a second run for the U.S. Senate. His main opponent in the Democratic primary, Texas was virtually a one-party state, and the most important elections were those that decided who would be a Democratic Party candidate, was Coke Stevenson. Johnson was criticized by Stevenson for supporting the Taft-Hartley Act. The American Federation of Labor was also angry with Johnson for supporting this legislation, and its June convention, the AFL broke 54-year tradition of neutrality and endorsed Stevenson. Johnson asked Tommy Corrigan to work behind the scenes at convincing union leaders that he was more pro-labor than Coke Stevenson. 11th August 1948, Corrigan told Harold Ickes that he had a terrible time straightening out labor and Johnson's campaign, but he believed he had sorted the problem out. On 2nd September, unofficial results had Coke Stevenson winning by 362 votes. However, by the time the results became official, Johnson was declared winner by 17 votes. Stevenson immediately claimed that he was a victim of election fraud. On 24th September, Judge T. Whitfield Davison invalidated the results of the election and set a trial date. The controversy over that runoff election had been subject to tantalizing conjecture for nearly 3 decades, ever since U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black abruptly halted an investigation, but the principals have been silent. George B. Parr the South Texas political boss whom Salas served for a decade, shot himself to death in June 1975. Johnson is dead, and so is his opponent. Salas, retired from his railroad telegrapher's job, is among the few living persons who has direct knowledge of the election. Salas says now that he lied during an aborted investigation of the election in 1948. When he testified that the vote count was proper and above board, I was just going along with my party, he says. Parr ordered that 200 odd votes to be added to Johnson's total from Box 13. Salas said he saw the fraudulent votes added in alphabetical order and then certified them as authentic on orders from Parr. The final stateside count included Box 13 votes, gave Johnson an 87 vote margin and a total tally approaching 1 million, and earned him the tongue-in-cheek nickname Landslide Lyndon. 3 days after the runoff, with Stevenson nearly leading the seesaw count nearly complete, Salas said a meeting was called in Parr's office 10 miles from Alice. Salas said he met with George B. Parr, Lyndon Johnson, Ed Lloyd, a Jim Wells County Democratic Executive Committee member, and Bruce Ainsworth, an Alice City Commissioner. Lloyd and Ainsworth, like Johnson and Parr, now are dead. Lyndon Johnson said, "If I can get 200 more votes, I got it won." A meeting was held that was attended by Tommy Corrigan, Francis Biddle, Abe Fortas, Joe Rule, Benjamin Cohen, and Jim Rowe. It was decided to take the case directly to Supreme Court. A motion was drafted and sent to Justice Hugo Black. On 28th September, Justice Black issued an order that put Johnson's name back on the ballot. Later, it was claimed by Rowe that Black made the decision following a meeting with Corrigan on 2nd November 1948. Johnson easily defeated Jack Porter, his Republican Party candidate. Coke Stevenson now appealed to the subcommittee on elections and privileges of Senate Rules and Administration Committee. Corrigan enjoyed a lot of good relationship with Senator Styles Bridges of New Hampshire. He was able to work behind the scenes to make sure that the ruling did not go against Johnson. Corrigan later told Johnson that he would have to repay Bridges for what he had done for him regarding the election. The Johnson-Stevenson case was also investigated by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. The Johnson was eventually cleared by Hoover, and corruption was allowed to take his seat in the Senate. Johnson soon emerged as an important member of Senate. Although he had been seen as a progressive with his support for the New Deal, he had conservative views on civil rights. He voted against the anti-lynching bill, and during the 1940s and 1950s, he opposed all attempts to pass civil rights legislation. In 1949, Johnson mounted a smear campaign against Leland Olds, chairman of the Federal Power Commission. Olds had managed to lower the prices of electricity. This upset Johnson's friend in the Texas oil industry. Johnson saw the best way to take care of this Olds was to brand him as a communist. Johnson had to use most of the tricks of what would come to be known as McCarthyism, and he nauseated some of his colleagues, but he had achieved his purpose. He had to convince the oil men back in Texas he was their man. Johnson was a key member of the Suite 8F group. The Suite 8F group was a collection of right-wing political and businessmen. The names come from the room in the Lamar Hotel in Houston where they held their meeting. Members of the group included George Brown, Herman Brown, Brown and Root, Jesse H. Jones, multimillionaire investor in large number of organizations and chairman of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Gus Wortham, American General Insurance Company, James Abercrombie, Cameron Iron Works, William Hobby, Governor of Texas and owner of the Houston Post, Albert Thomas, Chairman of the House Appropriate Committee, and John Connally, Governor of Texas. Alvin Wirtz and Edward Clark were also members of the Suite 8F group. Johnson was appointed Democratic Party whip in 1951. Over the next 4 years, impressed the leader of the party with his ability to do deals with people of different political opinions. In 1950s, Malcolm E. Wallace, working at the United States Department of Agriculture in Texas, it was at this time that Edward Clark introduced Wallace to Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1951, Wallace became Johnson's press secretary. Personal hitman, helped manage Johnson's media relations and public image. During this period of time, John Douglas Kinser had become known around town as a playboy, joining the Austin Community Theater Group and having numerous affairs, having been married. Wallace as well having an affair with Joseph Johnson, LBJ's sister. Josepha, like the both of them, had a wild personality being married. She was having an affair with John Kinser and Mac Wallace in the same period. Kinser asked Josepha to approach her brother for financial help. When Johnson refused, it is believed that Kinser resorted to blackmail. Johnson interpreted this as blackmail threat because of his sister told Kinser about his corrupt activities. LBJ ordered Wallace to assassinate Kinser. Wallace had an issue with Kinser. This side of the story is slightly different. Wallace had an issue with Kinser. John had been having an affair with Wallace's wife, and Wallace wasn't happy. He confronted Kinser inside the clubhouse while patrons stood outside talking and preparing to tee off. The confrontation didn't last long. Wallace shot Kinser 4 times. Kinser fell to the ground with mortal wounds. Wallace turned around and walked out of the clubhouse and past the stunned golfers. Wallace escaped in his station wagon. A customer at the golf course had heard the shooting and managed to make a note of Wallace's license plate. The local police force was able to use this information to arrest Wallace within 2 hours. Wallace was charged with murder but was released on bail after Edward Clark arranged for 2 of Johnson's financial supporters, M. E. Ruby and Bill Carroll, to post bonds on behalf of the defendant. Johnson's attorney, John Colfer, also agreed to represent Wallace. On 1st February of 1952, Wallace resigned from his government job in order to distance himself from Lyndon B. Johnson. His trial began 17 days later. Wallace did not testify. Colfer admitted his client's guilt, but claimed it was an act of revenge as Kinser had been sleeping with Wallace's wife. The jury found Wallace guilty of murder with malice aforethought. 11 of the jurors were for the death penalty. The 12th argued for imprisonment for life. Judge Charles O. Betts overruled the jury and announced a sentence of 5 years imprisonment. He suspended the sentence and Wallace was immediately freed. According to Bill Adler of the Texas Observer, several of the jurors telephoned John Kinser's parents to apologize for agreeing to a suspended sentence, but they said they did so only because threats had been made against their families.